In the winter of 1871, when the rivers of Sweden froze into silent mirrors of glass, there were whispers drifting between the pine trees, whispers of a woman in white, a bride whose beauty seemed stolen from the grave itself. She appeared at weddings and funerals alike, her black eyes fixed not on the living, but on something beyond. Men swore she moved with a grace that was not human, as though her steps did not touch the earth but hovered just above it. And behind her smile was a hunger, one that would later swallow the hearts of those who dared to draw near. It was said that she loved men with a fury no man could endure. She welcomed them into her embrace with promises of warmth, yet every embrace led them to coldness, a coldness deeper than any Swedish winter. Because her love did not end with flowers and kisses. It ended with shovels, with soil, with frozen rivers cracking beneath midnight hands. She buried them not in the ground like ordinary widows. No, she buried her lovers beneath the ice itself, sealing them in transparent coffins that the spring melt would never reveal. The villagers would look out across the river when the moon was full, and some swore they saw faces trapped beneath the frozen surface, faces of men staring upward in horror, eyes wide open, mouths agape as if caught in the very moment of their last scream. The authorities, of course, dismissed these stories as rural hysteria, but the elders knew. They knew because they had heard the stories long before. They had heard them whispered in older tongues, in songs that had been banned by the church, in tales mothers used to frighten their daughters into obedience. She was not the first bride. She was only the latest in a line of women who bore the same curse, a covenant between ice and blood, and 1871 was the year the covenant demanded payment in flesh. Now write in the comments which city and what time you are listening to us from, so we know who is absorbing this secret. The setting was Värmland County, a land of snowbound farms and forests stretching so deep they seemed endless. Life there was hard, every breath drawn against the cold, every meal carved out of frozen soil and slaughtered livestock. Villagers clung to the church, for faith was the only warmth that could not be stolen by winter. Yet, beneath this fragile devotion, old beliefs still pulsed. The belief that rivers were alive, that the ice had a memory, and that certain women carried its will inside them. By day, the villages looked ordinary. Men chopped firewood, women carried water, and children ran through frost-bitten paths. But by night, the atmosphere changed. Dogs barked at nothing. Windows frosted from the inside, and in the distance, bells would toll from chapels no priest had entered. The locals whispered that the bride walked then, searching for her next companion to drag beneath the frozen veil. Rumors spread like frostbite through the county. Some claimed they had seen her shadow moving across frozen lakes, her figure lit by torchlight, though no torches burned. Others swore they heard the muffled sound of pounding fists beneath the ice, as though the dead were trying to claw their way back to the surface. It created a tension so sharp that men avoided courting, fearing that if they fell in love, it would be their graves sealed in water. But the authorities needed order. Newspapers in Stockholm called the talk primitive. Priests declared it blasphemy. They said the people were only feeding old fears, and yet, men continued to vanish. Not many, just enough that families kept their daughters indoors at night, and wives slept with axes at their bedside. This was the landscape into which the bride emerged. A mixture of ordinary daily life and an undercurrent of dread so strong. It twisted every prayer into suspicion. Every wedding felt like a funeral. Every promise of love carried the sound of cracking ice. And if you feel ready to take the next step and become part of this journey, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Her name was whispered in fragments, never spoken aloud in the presence of fire or prayer. They called her Elin Andersdotter, though some believed that was not her true name. She was born in silence, in a snowstorm so fierce that half the village claimed it was the devil's breath that brought her forth. Her mother died within hours of the birth, her blood soaking into the sheets, freezing before the midwife's hands could wipe it away. And from the moment she drew her first breath, people swore they felt the cold deepen in the room, as though winter itself had entered their homes. Elin grew into a girl of strange habits. While other children laughed in the spring thaw, she sat by the riverside, staring into the water as if listening to something only she could hear. She never played, never cried, and never looked anyone directly in the eye. Her father, a timber worker, raised her alone, but he spoke rarely, as if weighed down by shame. When she walked through the village, people made the sign of the cross, women tugged their sons away, and yet, as she grew into womanhood, she became beautiful, too beautiful. Her skin remained pale even in the sun, her lips blood red, her hair black as a raven's wing. She was the image of what men desired and what women feared. Suitors came despite the warnings. The first was a farmhand who gave her a necklace carved of bone. Within weeks he disappeared. They said he had fallen into the river and drowned, but no body was ever found. Then came a merchant from Karlstad who offered her silks. His cart was discovered overturned in the forest, horses frozen in place, his body nowhere to be seen. Finally, there was the young priest who swore he would save her from the whispers. He too vanished, his prayer book discovered on the ice, pages torn by claws of frost. Elin's beauty drew them in, but something darker sealed their fate. It was not just her eyes, which seemed to pierce through flesh and bone. It was the way she smiled at men as though she already knew how their breath would sound, as it left their lungs for the last time. People began to say that she did not love in the way mortals love. She devoured, and those she devoured did not leave the earth through burial or fire. They sank into the ice, where their faces remained like trapped souls pressed against glass. The mystery of Elin Andersdotter did not unfold all at once. It was like the river ice itself, cracking in small places before giving way to a sudden plunge into black water. For months at a time, nothing unusual would happen, and villagers would allow themselves to hope that she was just another strange woman destined to live quietly at the edge of society. But then, another man would vanish, and whispers would rise again like smoke through a churchyard. The disappearances followed a rhythm, though no one dared speak it too plainly. They occurred only in winter, when the rivers froze solid and the land was locked in silence. It was as if the ice itself demanded a sacrifice, and Elin was its chosen hand. Men who disappeared in summer months were usually found, drowned in rivers, lost in forests, or claimed by wolves. But those who vanished in the frozen season were never seen again. Their names were spoken once in church, and then never repeated. It was safer to forget. Neighbors began to notice things around her home. Late at night, when the moon carved white scars across the snow, a faint light could be seen flickering from her window. It was not the golden glow of firelight, but a strange, bluish shimmer, like the reflection of the moon in water. Some claimed they heard voices inside her house, not the sound of Elin's soft singing, but the desperate cries of men calling for release. A black dog was said to guard her door, its eyes glowing in the dark. Yet when anyone tried to follow, the tracks in the snow would vanish, swallowed as though the earth itself refused to keep witness. The villagers grew restless. Mothers warned their sons to avoid her at all costs, yet some could not resist. There was something magnetic about her, something that drew men like moths to flame. They would pass her on the road, and though she said nothing, a single glance from her eyes left them trembling with desire and dread. They felt that if they ignored her, they would live as cowards, and if they approached, they would never live at all. But there were those who claimed Elin was no witch, no cursed maiden, but a victim of something older. They whispered that she had inherited a pact sealed long before her birth, a covenant between her bloodline and the river beneath the ice. And if that were true, then every vanished man was not her doing alone, but the fulfillment of a contract no human hand could break. It was the winter of 1872 when the first official inquiry was made into the disappearances. Too many sons and brothers had vanished for the silence to continue. Families pressed the local priest, Father Nilsson, to speak from the pulpit. He was a stern man, known for denouncing pagan superstition with fire in his voice. On a Sunday morning, he stood before the congregation and declared that the devil had found a dwelling place in their midst. He did not name Elin, but every eye turned toward her empty seat, and the silence that followed was heavier than stone. Father Nilsson resolved to confront her. He took with him a Bible, a silver cross, and 2 men from the village who claimed courage, though their hands trembled as they knocked upon her door. Elin answered, calm and graceful, her black hair loose across her shoulders. She invited them in with a smile that unsettled the men more than any scream could have. Inside, her house smelled faintly of river water, damp and sharp, as though the woe-elves themselves had been carved from ice. The priest demanded she confess her dealings with the devil. Elin only laughed, a sound that echoed strangely in the room, as though bouncing off unseen surfaces. She asked him what devil he meant, the one he preached about on Sundays, or the one that lived beneath the frozen river. For she claimed there was more than one kind of devil, and not all of them were named in Scripture. Father Nilsson attempted to read aloud from the Gospel of John, but his voice faltered. The 2 men swore later that the words froze in the air, turning to frost before their eyes. The priest's candle extinguished itself, though no wind stirred, and the silver cross grew so cold it burned his palm. Unable to bear it, they fled, leaving her laughing softly in the doorway. Word spread quickly. Some believed she had bested the priest with trickery, others that she was possessed, and still others whispered that perhaps she was not entirely human. A doctor from Karlstad was summoned to examine her, hoping science could explain what faith could not. He declared her perfectly healthy, though he avoided her eyes during the entire consultation. Weeks later, the doctor was found drowned in a shallow stream, though his body bore no wounds and the water barely reached his knees. The villagers grew divided, some terrified, some enthralled, but all knew one truth. Elin Andersdotter was no longer just a woman. She was becoming a legend, and legends in Sweden did not end with salvation. They ended in blood and ice. The turning point came in late January, when the river froze so thick that carts and horses could cross its surface without fear. Children played on the ice, their laughter echoing through the frosted woods. But laughter turned to screams when one child, a boy of only 8, slipped and fell hard upon the glassy surface. The crack beneath him spread wide, and though he was pulled back to safety, something else was revealed. Beneath the ice, a face stared upward, pale, distorted, lips parted as if in mid-breath. The boy's cries drew others, and soon the entire village gathered at the riverside. They saw not just one face, but 2, then 3, locked in silent agony beneath the frozen sheet. Men pounded the ice with axes, desperate to break through, but the river held firm, refusing to release its dead. Some swore the faces shifted as they struck, eyes moving, mouths stretching wider, as though mocking the living who stood above them. The bodies were never recovered. The thaw came weeks later, but when the river broke apart in roaring torrents, no corpses were carried downstream. It was as if the ice had swallowed them whole. Panic spread quickly. Mothers refused to let their children near the river. Men carried lanterns at night, though no flame could ward off what they feared. Whispers spread that Elin's lovers had been claimed, their spirits trapped forever beneath the frozen veil. When confronted, she did not deny it. She did not confess either. Instead, she spoke in riddles, saying that love was eternal, that true union required no burial ground, no coffin, only the embrace of water that never forgets. The villagers were horrified, but some men, drawn by her beauty and mystery, felt a strange pull toward her words. To them, she was not a monster but a siren, promising a love stronger than death. The priest demanded she be exiled. The elders urged the governor to act, but the authorities hesitated. Without bodies, there could be no crime. Without crime, there could be no punishment. And so the legend grew stronger, untouchable by law. That winter night, as torches flickered across the snow, a terrible realization took hold among the villagers. The river did not merely reflect their world. It held another, a dark mirror where those who vanished remained forever. And at its center stood Elin Andersdotter, the bride who did not bury her dead in soil but beneath ice where their eyes never closed. By February, the air in Vermland carried a weight heavier than the snow upon the roofs. The villagers no longer spoke freely. They whispered in corners, glancing toward the door as if even the wind could betray them. Each day seemed longer, each night darker, as though time itself had slowed to watch Elin Andersdottir's shadow grow across the land. Men vanished more frequently. A hunter, last seen following deer tracks into the woods, never returned. His dogs came home alone, their paws raw, their eyes wide with fear. Then a blacksmith from the neighboring parish failed to arrive for work. His hammer was later found on the riverbank, half buried in snow, still warm, as if it had been dropped only moments before. And always, after each disappearance, villagers claimed to see Elin walking the frozen river at night, her white dress trailing across the surface like smoke. The village began to divide. Some demanded she be burned, not tried, not questioned, but destroyed. They whispered of gathering men, carrying torches, ending the curse once and for all. Others, mostly younger men, hesitated. They said she was no witch but a victim, a woman burdened by forces beyond human comprehension. Some even confessed in secret that they had dreamt of her, standing at their bedsides, her fingers cold against their throats, her voice promising eternal love. The priest pressed harder. On Sundays, his sermons thundered with fury. He spoke of Jezebel, of Lilith, of women who bound men to destruction. He warned the people that the Icee was not only a grave, but a prison of souls, that every body sealed beneath it was a chain binding the village to damnation. His words stirred anger, but also fear. For if what he said was true, then Elin had not only claimed their men, but their eternity. Yet in the tavern where men drank to chase away dread, other theories emerged. Some swore she was no witch but a bride abandoned on her wedding night, cursed by grief so powerful that the river itself opened to receive her vengeance. Others whispered of older tales, of Necken, the river spirit who lured mortals to their deaths, and of maidens chosen to serve him for generations. Perhaps Elin was one of these. Perhaps she did not bury her lovers at all, but delivered them. And so, by the end of that winter month, the village stood at a breaking point. Every door was barred, every hearth burned late into the night. But the true fire smoldered in the hearts of men, the fire of desperation, of rage, of vengeance. And when such fire burns long enough, it consumes everything, even the ice itself. The breaking point arrived on a night when the moon hung low and red, staining the snow with its glow like spilled blood. The villagers gathered in secret, away from the church, away from the prying eyes of anyone who might betray them. There were 20 men in all, each carrying a torch, each armed with axes, knives, or the crude weapons of desperate farmers. Their breaths hung in the frozen air like smoke as they swore upon their lives that Elin Andersdottir would not see another dawn. They moved in silence toward her house at the edge of the forest. The wind was still, yet the trees creaked as though whispering warnings. The snow beneath their boots crunched with every step, too loud for men who hoped to carry out vengeance unseen. One of them muttered a prayer, another spat upon the ground. When they reached her home, they found it dark, no light within, no sound but the groaning of the timbers in the cold. The leader, a man named Lars Gunnarsson, stepped forward and raised his torch. He shouted her name, demanding she come out and face judgment. Silence answered him. With a curse, he kicked the door open, and the men surged inside. The house was bare. No fire in the hearth, no food upon the table, no clothing or belongings. Only the faint smell of water lingered in the air, a sharp, metal, lick dampness that made the men's throats tighten. Then came the sound, a low creak, like ice shifting beneath weight. The men froze, their torches flickering. From the far corner of the room, water began to seep up through the wooden floorboards. It spread quickly, soaking their boots, chilling their skin. One man cried out, dropping his torch, which hissed and died in the water. Panic rippled through the group. They backed away, but the water rose faster, climbing ankles, then knees, though no river or well was near enough to explain it. In that moment, a figure appeared at the doorway. Elin stood there, her white dress untouched by snow or water, her black hair falling in waves across her shoulders. Her eyes caught the torchlight, reflecting it like frozen glass. She did not speak. She only smiled. A smile that drained the courage from 20 armed men. The water stilled. The house fell silent again. And when the villagers fled into the night, torches scattered behind them, they swore they heard laughter carried across the wind. Not loud, not mocking, but soft. The laughter of a bride on her wedding night, welcoming her groom into eternity. That night, no man spoke of killing her again. But the silence that followed was far worse. The villagers' fear might have ended in silence, but silence does not last forever. News traveled, as it always does, carried by merchants who crossed the forests and rivers toward the capital. Whispers of men vanishing, of faces beneath ice, of a woman untouched by winter. They drifted into Stockholm taverns, where travelers drank and spoke too loudly. Soon the rumors reached the ears of officials who had no patience for superstition. By spring of 1872, an investigation was ordered. 2 men were sent north from the city. Inspector Henrik Falk, a stern figure with a soldier's bearing, and Professor Johan Rydberg, a physician known for Icee, exposing frauds of spirit mediums and healers. They were men of reason, chosen precisely because reason was needed to extinguish this fire of hysteria. The newspapers mocked the villagers, calling them backward, provincial, desperate to blame one woman for their hardships. The investigators carried that arrogance with them as they traveled, confident that fear would crumble before evidence. But when they arrived, they found not hysteria, but a community broken. Doors bolted, churches filled with trembling prayers, men avoiding the river as though it were a mouth waiting to swallow them whole. The air itself carried unease. Even Falk, hardened by years of police work, admitted to Rydberg that the silence of the woods felt unnatural, as if the trees themselves were listening. The villagers told their stories cautiously, afraid even to name Elin directly. But the evidence of disappearance was undeniable. Dozens of men gone in less than 2 years. No bodies, no blood, no sign of wolves or bandits. Only vanishing, as if the earth or something beneath it had claimed them. Elin herself greeted the investigators without fear. She stood at her doorway, her pale hands folded, her eyes calm as if she had been expecting them. Inspector Falk accused her bluntly, demanding to know what she had done with the missing men. She smiled softly and asked him if he had ever looked into ice long enough to see his own face staring back in ways he did not recognize. Professor Rydberg dismissed her words as madness, but privately he admitted her presence unsettled him. She moved with a stillness unlike any patient he had studied. Her pulse when taken was slow and cold, as if her blood carried winter inside it. He told Falk that she was no witch, but perhaps not entirely natural either. That night the investigators lodged in the village. Outside, the river groaned, cracks echoing like distant thunder, and Falk, though he never confessed it aloud, dreamt of pale faces pressing against glass, their eyes weo-eyed, their mouths opening and closing like fish beneath the frozen surface. Inspector Falk rose early, determined to gather proof that would cut through the fog of fear. He carried with him a pistol, though he knew in his heart that bullets could not wound shadows. Professor Rydberg followed reluctantly, keeping close to the warmth of his cloak, his skepticism shaken but not yet broken. Together they went to the river, where the villagers refused to tread. The ice stretched out before them, white and endless, like a frozen sky pressed flat against the earth. The surface was smooth, save for long cracks that spidered outward, deep enough to swallow light. Falk struck the ice with the butt of his pistol. The sound reverberated unnaturally, as though echoing through a hollow space. He knelt, peering downward, and for a moment thought he saw movement. Not fish, not drifting reeds, but the pale blur of something human, When he blinked, it was gone. Rydberg scoffed, though his voice trembled. He insisted they find tangible evidence, not illusions. So they questioned families of the missing. Wives showed them empty beds. Children cried for fathers who had vanished on ordinary days. One woman claimed her husband's voice still echoed outside her window at night, calling her name from beneath the snow. Another confessed she dreamt of her fiancé's face every evening, pressed against glass, mouth open as though he were drowning. The investigators grew uneasy. Testimonies blended into a chorus of the same haunting detail: the ice, the faces, the silence. Falk began keeping a notebook, filling its pages with the accounts, while Rydberg scribbled observations of the villagers' mental state. But the physician's hand shook, and his words became scattered. He could not explain why so many people across different homes repeated the same imagery. Madness, perhaps, or truth. That even, they returned to Elin's home. She welcomed them again, as though she had been waiting. Candles glowed in her parlor, though. The air smelled faintly of river water. Falk asked directly if she had killed the men. She tilted her head, eyes unblinking, and whispered, "They are not dead. They are beneath." When pressed for meaning, she only smiled. She asked Rydberg if he had ever lost someone he loved. His face blanched. She had spoken of a wound he had never shared aloud. "Then you know," she said. "The river keeps what we cannot bear to lose. I do not kill. I preserve." Falk called her mad, but her words lingered. That night neither man slept, for in the still hours before dawn, when the wind was silent, they heard faint knocking, rhythmic, hollow, as though from beneath the frozen ground. The next morning dawned grey and bitter, the sky low and heavy, as if pressing upon the earth. Inspector Falk tried to dismiss the noises of the night as dreams, the echoes of overworked imagination. But Professor Rydberg looked pale, his eyes bloodshot, his hands trembling when he lifted his pen. Neither spoke of what they had heard, for men of reason fear admitting that reason has limits. Yet the river would not let them forget. That afternoon, a commotion arose near the edge of the village. Children, disobeying their mothers, had returned to the frozen water to play. One of them cried out, pointing down through the ice. The crowd gathered, and Falk and Rydberg pushed their way to the front. What they saw forced the crowd into gasps and silence. There, beneath the transparent surface, was a body. Not the grey blur of something distorted by depth, but a clear face staring upward. A man's eyes wide open, his mouth frozen mid-cry. His features were so distinct that 2 villagers screamed his name at once. Erik Lundgren, the blacksmith who had vanished 2 months before. His body lay only inches beneath the surface. His hands spread flat as though he had pressed himself against glass. Begging for release, the crowd demanded the ice be broken. Falk ordered axes, and men hacked at the surface until their shoulders ached. But the blows rang hollow, as if striking iron. The ice did not break. It did not even crack further. Erik's face remained clear beneath them, yet unreachable. The harder they struck, the more their tools seemed to dull, until men collapsed in exhaustion, sobbing, cursing the river itself. Rydberg, who had mocked the villagers only days before, stood pale and silent. His skepticism shattered. He knelt by the ice, staring down at Erik's face. Then he recoiled, clutching his chest. He swore the man's eyes moved, shifting to look directly at him, blinking once as if in recognition. The villagers fled screaming. Falk pulled Rydberg away, though he resisted like a man torn from a lover. That night, neither investigator spoke of what they had seen, but the silence between them carried a new weight. It was no longer the silence of doubt. It was the silence of men who had seen what they could not explain. And as darkness fell, torches burned late in the village. Mothers prayed louder, fathers drank deeper. For now there was proof, and proof is far more dangerous than rumor. Proof does not fade, proof endures. By the end of that week, the river became a shrine of dread. Crowds gathered daily, despite their terror, to stare into the frozen surface. And with each passing dawn, More shapes seemed to appear beneath the glass. A hand here, reaching upward. A face pressed sideways, lips blue, hair drifting in frozen strands. Men swore they recognized fathers, brothers, even sons among the icy gallery. Women fainted at the sight of familiar rings on pale fingers. It was as if the river was a mirror of the village itself, reflecting its people, but only those who had vanished. The missing were all there, laid out as if on display, entombed in crystal. No one could explain how bodies that should have rotted or drifted away downstream remained perfectly preserved, as though death itself had halted to honor Elin's will. Inspector Falk paced like a soldier in a losing battle. He ordered more axes, then saws, even fire brought to melt the surface. But the river resisted. Flames hissed and died, smoke curling across ice that remained cold as stone. The more the men worked, the less progress they made, until their labor looked less like rescue and more like ritual, a futile offering to forces they could not comprehend. Professor Rydberg stopped speaking of science altogether. He filled notebooks with sketches of the faces beneath the ice, muttering about thresholds between states of matter, about bodies refusing decay. But when Falk caught him staring too long, lips trembling with something close to awe, the inspector struck his journal from his hands and demanded he remember his duty. Meanwhile, the villagers turned their eyes not just to the river, but to Elin Andersdotter. She did not hide. She walked openly through the snow, her black shawl trailing, her gaze steady. Some spat at her feet, others crossed themselves. But there were men who had lost wives or lived in loneliness, who found themselves unable to look away. They whispered that perhaps she alone could explain what lay beneath the ice, that perhaps she could call their loved ones back. The priest thundered from the pulpit that Elin was the devil's bride, a witch who had traded the souls of men for her beauty. He urged the villagers to drive her out, to burn her house, to salt the ground. But fear of the river outweighed fear of her, for even as they cursed her name, none dared act. That night, more voices rose from the riverbank, low, muffled cries that carried over the wind. Those who heard swore it was the voices of the dead, calling from beneath the ice. And when the villagers looked upon Elin the next morning, they saw not fear in her eyes, but something worse, recognition. By the turn of the month, the fear in Ångermanland had curdled into fury. What began as whispers over hearths now erupted into accusations in the marketplace. Elin Andersdotter's name was spoken openly, her every movement watched. Mothers pulled their children indoors when she passed, and old men spat over their shoulders to ward off her shadow. Inspector Falk, weary from sleepless nights, gathered the elders and demanded they speak plainly. "Do you believe this woman has cursed your river?" he asked. No one replied at first, but the silence was answer enough. Then one voice, cracked, trembling, rose from the crowd. "Every man who lay with her lies beneath the ice." Another joined. "She does not bury them. She keeps them." Soon the square thundered with agreement. Elin herself seemed unbothered. She attended Mass without lowering her head, though the priest refused her communion. She walked the frozen path to fetch water from the river, even as the villagers hissed and crossed themselves. When Inspector Falk confronted her, demanding to know if she recognized the men beneath the ice, she did not deny it. She lifted her chin, her voice low and even. "They chose to follow me. I did not drag them there." Those words spread through the village like poison. Some took them as confession, others as proof of her sorcery. Professor Rydberg scribbled furiously in his notebook, writing that Elin was a vector, not a culprit, a door through which the river swallows men whole. Falk slammed the journal shut and warned the professor that his fascination was a dangerous indulgence. But deep down, even the inspector felt it. That chill, gnawing sense that Elin was not lying. The villagers demanded action. "Bind her," they said. "Interrogate her. If she burns, the ice will crack." The priest fanned their rage with scripture, declaring Elin the living root of corruption. Yet when Falk considered the mob, he hesitated. He had seen her eyes, steady and calm, as though she knew something he could not touch. She was no frantic criminal. She was something else, something that frightened him more than guilt ever could. That night, the river grew restless. Witnesses swore the ice groaned like a living beast, echoing through the valley. And when torches lit the banks, they saw that the faces beneath had shifted, pressed closer to the surface, mouths open in silent screams. One man fainted, another vomited, and a third, driven mad with grief, threw himself onto the ice, clawing until his fingers bled. He swore he heard his brother calling from below. Elin watched from the shadows, her breath steady, her figure framed by the black trees. To some, she looked like a widow, to others, a queen. But to most, she looked like the only one left in command of a nightmare no man could control. The night the villagers decided to confront Elin Andersdotter, the moon was a sickle of silver above the frozen valley. Men gathered with torches, women clutched rosaries, and the priest carried his Bible like a weapon. Their breath smoked in the air as they marched toward her small wooden house, boots crunching in the snow like the drumbeat of judgment. Inside, Elin was waiting. She had lit no fire. The single candle on her table cast long shadows, and her black hair fell over her shoulders like a veil. She did not bolt the door, nor did she run. When the mob hammered their fists against the frame, she opened it herself, calm as a queen, welcoming guests to her court. "Witch," spat the priest. "You have bound the souls of men beneath the ice. Tonight we unbind them." He raised the Bible high, and the crowd shouted in reply. Some demanded she be taken to the river at once, chained and forced to confess. Others cried for fire, eager to see her house consumed and her ashes scattered. But Elin did not flinch. Her voice was quiet, yet it carried over the noise. "Do you believe burning me will melt the river? Do you believe tearing me apart will bring back your dead?" Her eyes swept over them, not pleading, not fearful, but steady, as though she saw through each of them. "It is not I who keeps them," she said. "It is the river. And the river listens to no priest, no soldier, no king." The words unsettled even Inspector Falk, who stood apart from the mob, his hand on the hilt of his sword. He saw in her not hysteria, not guilt, but certainty. The terrible conviction of someone who understood a law older than men. Yet the villagers, drunk on rage and grief, would not be swayed. They surged forward, dragging her into the snow, binding her wrists with rope. She did not resist. They marched her to the riverbank. Torches flickered against the ice, casting trembling light over the faces beneath. The villagers forced her to kneel, the priest chanting prayers of exorcism. But as he shouted scripture, the river groaned, louder than before, a deep cracking sound that shook the ground beneath their boots. The faces beneath the ice seemed to stir, mouths widening, eyes rolling as though alive. A scream rose from the crowd as one of the bound corpses pressed so close to the surface that its frozen lips seemed to move. The man whose brother had vanished shouted, "He is calling for me," and fell to his knees, sobbing. The mob's fury wavered, their chants turning to whimpers. And there, kneeling in the snow, Elin smiled for the first time. Not mockery, not joy, but recognition, as if the river itself had answered her. The air on the riverbank thickened with a silence so heavy it crushed the breath from the villagers' lungs. Their torches sputtered, hissing against the sudden gust that swept across the ice. It was not wind from the sky, but something rising from the frozen surface itself. A breath, cold and ancient, curling around them like the exhale of a buried giant. Elin knelt in the snow, her wrists bound, her head bowed, but her expression remained unchanged. The priest screamed scripture, his voice cracking, his hands shaking as he raised the crucifix higher. Yet the words sounded hollow against the groaning of the river. The earth rumbled beneath their feet, and the ice fractured with a sound like bones snapping under weight. Inspector Falk stepped forward, his sword drawn, shouting for the crowd to fall back. But fear made them deaf. They surged closer, torches held high, determined to see Elin destroyed before the nightmare could swallow them whole. A young boy hurled a stone at her, striking her shoulder. She did not move. Instead, she lifted her eyes, fixing the mob with a look that froze them more completely than the river ever could. Then it happened. The surface beneath their feet shifted, a ripple traveling across the ice as though something massive stirred below. Faces pressed harder against the barrier, their features distorted, eyes bulging, mouths stretching wider than human mouths should. One hand, pale and claw-like, broke through for an instant before snapping back down as the crack sealed itself again. The crowd recoiled in horror. The man whose brother was beneath the ice shrieked, dropped his torch, and leapt forward. He clawed at the surface with bare hands, tearing his flesh until blood smeared the frozen glass. He screamed his brother's name until his voice cracked, then pressed his ear against the ice as though to hear better. And in that terrible moment, some swore they heard a reply. Muffled, watery, unmistakably human. Panic tore through the villagers. Some fled into the night, their torches bobbing like dying stars across the snow. Others fell to their knees begging God to deliver them. The priest dropped his Bible into the snow, his lips moving in silent prayer, too broken to continue aloud. Through it all, Elin remained unmoved. When the ropes around her wrists slipped loose, no one saw how, she stood. Slowly, deliberately, she placed her bare hand on the ice. The groan, river, but the choice before them: do nothing and watch their men vanish, act against Elin and risk tearing open the barrier that kept the horrors contained. Falk stared at them, his jaw clenched. He was no mystic, no priest, but a man of order, of law. And yet, the image of her hand pressed to the ice haunted him. He could not escape the memory of how the groaning stopped, how the river seemed to obey her. For the first time he understood that this was not a case to be solved, but a force to be endured. When the meeting ended, the priest stormed out, vowing to rouse the faithful to righteous vengeance. Rydberg lingered, eyes gleaming with dangerous curiosity, and Falk remained at the table, alone, staring at the wood grain as though searching for answers hidden in the lines. That night, official word spread. The disappearance of the men was to be declared an accident, the ice too treacherous, the deaths a tragedy of nature. No mention of Elin, no mention of the river. The truth would be buried as surely as the bodies beneath the ice. But secrets, like corpses, have a way of surfacing. The cover-up might have silenced the newspapers, but it could not silence the people. Ångermanland was too small for secrets, and every man, woman and child carried the same memory of that night at the river. The priest's sermons grew harsher, his voice raw with fury, condemning Elin Andersdotter as a bride of Satan. He warned that unless she was destroyed, the dead would break free and claim the living. Yet, each time he spoke her name, he noticed the shifting eyes of the men in the pews, men who had lost brothers, fathers or sons, and who could not stop staring at the riverbank where she walked. For Elin no longer avoided the public. She appeared daily by the frozen water, her shawl draped around her shoulders, her boots crunching on snow. She would kneel, place her hand upon their surface, and sit in silence as though listening to a choir only she could hear. Mothers pulled their children away, but the men lingered. They claimed they could feel something when she touched the ice. A strange calm, a pause in the gnawing grief that had consumed them. They began to whisper that she was not a witch, but a keeper, a guardian who held back the chaos in exchange for her own isolation. The village split. Some prayed for her destruction, others for her protection. By night, when the wind carried strange groans across the valley, both sides huddled in fear, each convinced they alone were right. Inspector Falk patrolled the streets like a sentinel, but he knew order was slipping. The law was paper in a storm. It could not bind what the villagers had seen. He caught men leaving flowers by Elin's doorstep, tokens of devotion disguised as offerings. He caught others sharpening knives, swearing vengeance for the brothers lost. When he asked Elin if she feared what might come, she only smiled faintly and said, Fear belongs to those who do not understand their place in the order of things. Professor Rydberg grew more reckless. He followed her, sketching, writing, muttering theories that no one dared read. He claimed Elin was a threshold, a living key that locked the river in its frozen state. If she falters, he whispered, the ice will not hold. The priest, furious at her growing influence, plotted with his most loyal followers. They would not wait for the inspector's hesitation, nor for God's hand to act. They would make their move soon, and with holy fire. But even as they sharpened their blades and prepared their torches, the river stirred. At night, villagers swore they saw shadows moving beneath the surface, not just faces but whole bodies, shifting in silence like an army waiting for its command. And some began to wonder, if Elin was truly in Leah, Gua with the devil, why did the devil himself seem to answer to her? The night they came for her, the village lay smothered in silence. No dogs barked, no children stirred. Only the crunch of boots in the snow marked the path of the priest and his chosen men. They carried torches wrapped in oil-soaked rags, axes, and the iron chains usually reserved for criminals. Their faces were set, grim and pale, as though they marched not for justice, but for their own salvation. Inspector Falk had warned them that rashness would end in ruin, but his words had fallen on deaf ears. The priest whispered that God demanded sacrifice, that fear must be drowned in holy flame. His voice was thin with desperation, yet the men clung to it like drowning sailors clutching driftwood. They reached Elin's house under the veil of midnight. The candle in her window flickered as though it had been waiting. When the priest raised his hand to command silence, the men rushed forward, kicking down the door. Elin did not scream. She stood at the center of the room, as though expecting them, her black shawl draped across her shoulders like a crown of shadows. The priest thrust his crucifix toward her, chanting scripture. His men seized her arms, forcing chains around her wrists. Still, she did not resist. Her voice was soft, almost tender. You believe chains can hold me, but it is not I you are binding. It is yourselves. The words chilled even her captors, but rage pushed them forward. They dragged her through the snow toward the riverbank. Torches bobbed in the dark, their light painting trembling shapes on the ice. The priest raised his arm, shouting that her body would be burned upon the frozen surface as an offering of purity. His followers roared in agreement, though their eyes darted nervously toward the faces beneath the ice, which seemed to shift and watch. The moment they forced Elin to her knees at the water's edge, the river groaned. The sound was deeper this time, heavier, like the cracking of a colossal spine. The torches flickered violently. One man screamed as his flame went out, snuffed by a sudden gust that rose not from the sky, but from the ice itself. Then the surface split. A jagged fracture tore across the river, and from its depths came a sound that no man could mistake for wind. A chorus of voices, wailing, rising, demanding. The faces beneath pressed upward, mouths open wide, eyes rolling. The men staggered back in terror, some dropping their torches, others their weapons. Only Elin remained still. She lifted her bound hands and laid them gently upon the ice. The fracture sealed with a hiss. The voices quieted, though they did not vanish. The priest fell to his knees, clutching his crucifix so tightly his knuckles bled. Elin's eyes swept over them. You see now, she whispered. It is not me you fight. It is the river. And the river already owns you. None of the men spoke. Some fled into the dark, never to return. Those who stayed could not decide if she had spared them or condemned them to something worse. By dawn, the village was no longer the same. The priest's men returned in fragments, some limping, some wide-eyed and silent, others never returning at all. Their torches had been extinguished, their resolve shattered. When questioned, they spoke in half sentences, trembling with memories they dared not finish. One muttered that he had seen his dead father staring up at him from beneath the ice. Another swore he felt hands clawing at his legs, though nothing touched him. The priest himself refused to speak at all. his crucifix clutched so tightly that the imprint of its shape had scarred his palm. The story spread faster than fire. Soon every villager knew the raid had failed. The whispers grew bolder. She cannot be harmed. The river protects her. She is no woman, but a bride of death itself. Fear remained, but it bent in a new direction. Not toward rebellion, but toward submission. Mothers still led their children away, but they did so in silence. Men still spat in the snow when her name was spoken, but only when they were certain she was not within earshot. Elin herself moved through the streets as if nothing had changed, yet everything had. Doors opened when she passed, not to welcome her but to make way. Villagers left bread and meat upon her steps, offerings made not of devotion but of survival. Some began to bow their heads in her presence, as though she were a sovereign draped in mourning. Inspector Falk saw it all with burning shame. He had been trained to uphold order, yet he felt himself powerless in the face of her quiet reign. Even the law bent around her. To arrest her now would mean mutiny. To execute her would mean catastrophe. The village no longer feared the crown's authority. It feared Elin Andersdotter and the black river that moved to her will. Professor Rydberg grew only more intoxicated by her presence. He shadowed her like a scribe following a prophet, filling pages with notes on her gestures, her words, her silences. "She is the mediator," he whispered to Falk one night. "A threshold made flesh. The river speaks through her, and she keeps it from devouring us all." Falk wanted to strike him to silence his madness, but deep down he wondered if it was true. The priest, broken yet unyielding, withdrew into the church. There, his sermons became fevered rants, warning that Ångermanland had surrendered to a queen of ice, that the villagers were now her subjects, bound not to God but to her. Yet fewer came to hear him. The pews stood half empty, the faithful slipping away to watch Elin kneel by the river instead, and the river itself grew restless. The cracks in the ice did not vanish. Each night the groaning deepened, and the faces beneath pressed closer, more defined, as though waiting for their mistress's command. By the third week of winter, the priest could no longer bear his humiliation. His sermons echoed through an empty church, his warnings drowned out by Sebaon. Silence. The villagers no longer knelt before the altar. They lingered by the riverbank instead, watching Elin with wary reverence as she pressed her palm to the ice. The bells of the church rang hollow, while the groaning of the frozen water seemed to speak with greater authority than any scripture. In his chambers, the priest tore at his own vestments, raving by candlelight. "She is not a woman," he hissed, "but a throne for the devil himself." His followers had dwindled, reduced to a handful of the most desperate, but their desperation gave them teeth. They whispered that if the village would not listen, then the church must act from above. Letters were drafted, sealed with trembling hands, and sent across the snows to the bishop in Uppsala. Their plea was simple: send men, send fire, send holy authority before Sweden itself was swallowed. While the messengers rode, the priest plotted. He knew he could not strike Elin directly, not after the failure of his raid. But there were other ways to wound her. He began to call secret meetings in the crypt beneath the church, candlelit gatherings where he whispered to the grieving. "She does not keep your husbands," he told the widows. "She enslaves them. They call to you from the ice, not for comfort, but for release. Do you not hear their torment?" His words poisoned the air, rekindling rage in hearts dulled by resignation. Yet outside his dark circles, the village was shifting. Men who once spat at Elin now left her offerings openly. A group of farmers began to build benches near the riverbank, claiming they wished to watch the ice in case it shifted, but Falk knew the truth. It was a chapel in all but name. They sat in silence, eyes fixed not on the priest's altar, but on Elin's still figure as she communed with the frozen dead. Inspector Falk wrestled with his conscience. He saw the fracture widening between church and village, faith and fear. He knew the bishop's men would come, and when they did, they would not see nuance. They would bring pyres, gallows, perhaps worse. And he wondered, what would happen if they tried to sever the bond between Elin and the river? Elin herself seemed untouched by the storm gathering around her. She walked the snow as though it bowed beneath her boots. Her voice was rarely heard, but when it was, men fell silent. To them she was neither witch nor widow anymore. She was something older, a sovereign crowned in frost, enthroned upon the silence of the river. The priest saw it too, and in his madness, he began to dream of fire, not just to consume her, but to consume the river itself, to scorch the ice until the dead beneath were erased forever. The messengers reached Uppsala through biting winds and roads carved into walls of snow. For days they rode in silence, clutching their letters as though salvation itself was bound in wax. When the bishop finally read the reports, his face paled. Sweden had endured witch trials before, accusations scrawled in desperate ink by frightened villagers. But this spoke of an entire town bending not to Satan's whispers in the dark, but to a woman who stood openly as a rival to the church. That, he knew, could not be allowed to fester. Orders were written swiftly. A retinue of soldiers and clerics would depart south to investigate and, if necessary, purge. To them, purge was not metaphor. It was fire, axe, and rope. The bishop's quill pressed so deep into parchment that the letters tore like wounds. His words were final. If the village no longer bends the knee, bend it for them. If the witch has grown into a queen, strip her of her throne. Back in the village, whispers traveled quicker than smoke. Some claimed to have seen riders on the horizon already, black silhouettes against the frozen dawn. Others swore that the bishop's men would arrive by the next full moon. The priest, fevered and trembling, took this as proof that God had answered him. He climbed his pulpit again, his voice ragged, but filled with a cruel kind of triumph. "Do you hear?" he shouted to the half-empty church. "The shepherd comes, and the wolves shall scatter." Ioe. But outside, the air carried a different sound, the deep creaking of the ice beneath the river. Elin stood upon its edge, her hand resting lightly on the frost, as if she were listening to a language no one else could hear. Falk approached cautiously, unsure whether to announce himself. At last, she turned her head, her eyes catching the dull glow of dusk. "They are coming," she said simply, her voice neither afraid nor defiant. "Not for me, but for the silence I keep." Falk shivered. "If they come with soldiers, they'll burn you, and the village too if it stands in their way." Elin's gaze returned to the river. Then the village must choose whether it prays to fire or to ice. In the tavern, men muttered nervously over their cups. Some cursed the priest for inviting ruin. Others swore they would fight to protect Elin, claiming the river had given them more than the church ever had. Families argued through the night, torn between scripture and survival. Old loyalties dissolved like snow in thaw. The choice was no longer distant. By spring, riders would arrive, armed with scripture, steel and smoke. And when they did, the village of Edefors would either kneel with the church or rise with the river. The first rumors of hooves came not from the priest or the council, but from children. Playing near the tree line, they swore they heard the distant echo of horses long before the grown men dared admit it. Their whispers crawled through the streets like frost across window panes. Mothers pulled their children inside, as if a mere door could shield them from what approached. By evening, the whole village buzzed with dread, though not a single rider had yet been seen. At the tavern, a silence had settled over the two tables where once laughter and songs filled the nights. Now only the crackling fire dared make noise. Men sat with mugs untouched, staring into the flames as if seeking prophecy. "They'll come with crosses raised," one finally muttered, "but their swords will do the talking." Another spat into the ashes. "The church has never cared about us, only about control. We kneel to their God, yet our bellies starve, and now they want to take the one who has kept us alive." His voice broke, and the room sank deeper into uneasy stillness. Meanwhile, Elin continued her rituals by the frozen river. She placed her hands upon the ice, whispering to it as though it were kin. Some villagers watched from afar, torn between awe and terror. The priest used this as fodder, spreading sermons of doom. "Behold the harlot of the river, consorting with demons. She buries men in the cold womb of death and dares call it blessing." Sin. His voice rang out across the square, but fewer ears seemed willing to listen. A split had opened wide, and faith itself was shattering. That night, Falk returned from a scouting path along the ridge. His face was pale, his breath ragged. "I saw them," he whispered to Elin in the dark. "Torches. At least a dozen men, maybe more. They'll be here within days." Elin stood silent, her figure carved in shadow. Finally, she asked, "Do you fear them?" "Yes," Falk admitted. His hands trembled as he spoke, "because I do not know if I fear them for what they might do to you, or for what you might do to them." The next morning, villagers gathered in hushed groups. Some demanded weapons be readied, others begged to submit peacefully to hand Elin over and save their children. A mother clutched her infant tightly and cried, "Better one life than all of us." An old man shook his head. "You fool! If you give them one, they will take 10. That is the way of the church." And so the village stood upon a knife's edge. Every breath, every glance toward the horizon felt heavier. Soon, the Black Riders would come, and with them, a reckoning no frost could hide. The first sight of them came at dawn, when the mist still clung low over the frozen fields. From the ridge above the village, a line of torches descended like a serpent of fire, its body swaying with the rhythm of hooves. The sound followed, the heavy, deliberate beat of horses trampling snow into mud. The village bell did not ring, for no one dared call it an alarm. Instead, they watched in silence, every man, woman, and child huddled in doorways or pressed against frost-glazed windows, their breath clouding the glass. The soldiers wore dark wool and iron, their tabards bearing the cross of Uppsala. Behind them rode 2 clerics, their faces pale with fasting and prayer, their eyes sharp with conviction. They carried no weapons in hand, yet their very presence felt like sharpened steel. To the villagers, it was as though the storm of judgment itself had entered their valley. The captain dismounted in the square, his boots crunching in the snow. His voice carried the authority of command, though his tone was almost weary. "By decree of the bishop," he announced, "we come to investigate claims of heresy, witchcraft, and rebellion against the Holy Church. You will present the woman called Elin." His eyes scanned the faces, searching for signs of betrayal, but found only bowed heads and trembling shoulders. The priest, trembling with fever but burning with triumph, stumbled forward. "She dwells near the river," he cried, his voice shrill. "She has deceived these people, bound them to darkness, and buried her lovers beneath the ice. Deliver her, and save your souls." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some nodded, eager to wash their hands of blame. Others stiffened, anger flashing in their eyes. One man spat into the snow. "You speak of salvation," he growled, "yet your God has given us nothing but hunger." The captain's gaze snapped to him, cold as the steel at his side. "Choose your words carefully," he warned. "The church does not forget rebellion." At the river's edge, Elin already knew. She had felt their arrival in the trembling ice, in the shift of wind that carried foreign voices. She did not hide. Instead, she stood waiting, her cloak pulled tight, her eyes calm and unreadable. Falk approached in a panic. "They're here," he hissed. "Do you hear me? They are in the square now. You must flee." But Elin only smiled faintly, a bitter curve of her lips. "Flee? To where? This river knows me. The land holds me. I will not leave my own shadow behind to please their fire." Behind her, the ice groaned, echoing like a drumbeat of the earth itself, as though it, too, anticipated the clash to come. Snow fell heavier that night, thickening the air, muting sound as if the world itself wished not to hear what was about to unfold. The soldiers moved from the square toward the river, their torches casting orange halos against the white drifts. Each step broke the crust of ice and snow beneath their boots, each sound amplified in the silence of fear. Behind them trailed the priest, half delirious with triumph, and a knot of villagers who followed more out of dread than loyalty. The closer they came to the river, the more the atmosphere seemed to shift. The air grew colder, sharper, almost electric. Even the soldiers, hardened by years of campaigns, tightened their grips on weapons and glanced nervously at one another. It was as though the river itself exhaled a warning. Elin stood waiting at the edge, her figure outlined by the pale glow of moonlight reflecting off the frozen surface. She did not tremble. Her cloak stirred lightly in the wind, but her face was still, carved from resolve and something far deeper. Falk stood a few paces behind her, fists clenched, caught between fury and despair. The captain stepped forward, his voice carrying authority across the frozen expanse. "You are Elin of Edeforce," he declared. "You are accused of witchcraft, of binding this village in rebellion, of defiling holy law. By order of the Wang, Bishop, you are to submit and be taken to Uppsala for judgment." His torch flared, a fiery demand against the stark darkness. Elin did not move. Instead, she raised her hand and let it hover just above the ice. A low groan rippled across the river, the sound of water pressing against its prison. The soldiers flinched, some instinctively tightening their grip on hilts. "This is my judgment," she said, her voice steady, ringing with something ancient. "This river bore my tears, my secrets, my blood. If you seek to take me from it, then you will taste what lies beneath." The villagers gasped. Some crossed themselves. Others fell to their knees, whispering prayers not to the church, but to the river itself. The priest shrieked, pointing his shaking finger, "See how she calls the abyss, strike her down." But no one moved, for in that moment, fear bound them all. Not fear of Elin alone, but of the choice her defiance forced upon them. To side with her was to turn against the church. To surrender her was to betray the only one who had kept them alive through famine and frost. The captain's jaw tightened. His eyes flickered between the trembling villagers and the woman who stood like an unyielding monument against the night. "So," he said grimly, "this is how rebellion begins." The river moaned again, louder this time, like the earth itself preparing to crack open. The captain gave a sharp signal with his hand, and two soldiers advanced toward Elin. Their boots crunched over the snow, torches held high, swords drawn but trembling slightly. Behind them the priest shouted prayers like weapons, each syllable hurled against the night. "In the name of Christ, bind the witch, break the chains of Satan." His voice cracked, his words feverish, but the soldiers hesitated, as though the weight of the river's silence pressed harder on their shoulders than his commands. Elin stood, but unflinching. Her eyes locked with theirs, not with rage, but with an unnerving calm that seemed to hollow the courage out of them. Falk stepped forward suddenly, his voice breaking through the frozen air. "Do not touch her!" His cry startled even himself, but it rang like steel. "You have no right to steal what the river has claimed." The captain snarled, "Seize him as well." But before the soldiers could move, a villager from the crowd broke free. An old man, bent with years but fierce in spirit, swung a rusted axe and slammed it into the snow between the soldiers and Elin. "No further," he barked, his voice trembling but resolute. "You will not take her from us." The square erupted in chaos. Some villagers cried out, begging for peace. Others surged forward, emboldened by the old man's defiance. A soldier shoved him aside, and the axe clattered against the ice. In an instant, Falk lunged, striking the soldier with his bare fists. The torch fell, hissing as it struck the snow. The soldiers drew blades. Steel gleamed in the moonlight, and for the first time, blood stained the riverbank as one man's cheek split under the captain's strike. A scream tore through the air, not from the wounded, but from a woman in the crowd clutching her child. "Stop! Please stop!" she cried. Yet the frenzy would not yield. Eileen's voice cut through the madness. She did not shout, but her words carried as if the river itself spoke them. "You bring fire against ice, and fire dies here." She lowered her hand against the frozen surface. A thunderous crack resounded, a shiver tearing through the river. The ice split, water surging upward like a living thing, black and violent. Soldiers stumbled back, torches snuffed out in the spray. Panic seized the villagers. Some fled, others dropped to their knees. The priest screamed incoherently, half in prayer, half in terror. The captain, drenched and shaking, glared at Eileen, as though staring at an enemy not of flesh, but of elements. The night had turned. No longer was this a mere arrest. It was war, waged not only with swords but with the fury of earth and water itself. The crack in the river widened, jagged lines racing outward like veins of black fire. Water surged up between them, hissing against the torches, drowning flame in hiss and steam. Horses reared and screamed, their hooves slipping on the frost as soldiers struggled to restrain them. The square that had been an arena of command and obedience now dissolved into chaos. And in that chaos, loyalties began to show their true faces. One villager, a broad-shouldered farmer, seized a soldier's spear and wrenched it from his grasp, thrusting him backward into the snow. Another fell upon the clerics, tearing at their holy banners with fists hardened by years of work. Shouts mingled with prayers, screams with curses. It was no longer a village, it was a battlefield. The captain fought like a man possessed, his blade cutting through the air with deadly precision. But with each swing, more villagers pressed against him, no longer afraid, their hunger and grief boiling into rage. Still, the soldiers were trained, their iron discipline holding even as the ground beneath them groaned with the river's unrest. And through it all stood Eileen, motionless at the water's edge. She did not strike, did not scream. She only pressed her hand to the ice, whispering words too low for any ear but the river's. The response came not in language, but in tremors. The low, guttural roar of the current forcing itself against its prison, cracks multiplied, water spitting upward like black serpents. The priest, seeing this, fell to his knees and clawed at the snow. His voice was shrill, broken. "She calls the flood. She will drown us all. Kill her before the river takes us." But no one heeded him. The soldiers were too occupied with villagers, the villagers too caught between rage and terror. Falk forced his way through the melee, blood running from a cut at his brow. He reached Eileen, gasping, "You'll bring it down on everyone. You'll bury them in water and ice." Her gaze did not shift from the river. "The river chooses," she said. "It remembers every body they forced me to bury. It knows its own justice." A deafening crack thundered, louder than any before. A section of ice near the bank collapsed, swallowing a torch and a soldier with it. His scream was brief, cut off by the choke of freezing water. For a moment, everyone froze. Soldier, villager, priest, staring at the black gap in the river where a man had vanished. Silence fell, heavy and absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The river had spoken once, and all who watched knew it would speak again. The silence after the soldiers' drowning lasted only a heartbeat. Then the river roared. It was not the sound of mere water, but something deeper, older, as if the earth itself exhaled its fury through the cracks of the ice. The villagers staggered back, clutching one another. Soldiers tightened their grips on weapons, though steel meant nothing against the flood. Torches hissed and died, leaving only moonlight to paint the scene in silver and shadow. The ice gave way again. Two more soldiers, standing too close to the widening fissures, plunged downward with shouts that froze to silence as the current devoured them. The river did not hesitate. It pulled them under with merciless hunger, swallowing armor, flesh, and voice alike. The priest wailed, collapsing in the snow. "Do you see? Do you see?" His words were frantic, torn from a throat nearly gone raw. "She is the bride of the abyss. She commands the grave itself." But his cries no longer sounded like triumph. They were the shrieks of a man whose faith had twisted into terror. The captain shouted orders, his voice cutting through the storm of panic. "Form the line. Hold the villagers back. Seize her now, before widening more." The priest, wild-eyed, crawled toward the villagers, shrieking, "Give her up! Give her to them! To the flood! Only her blood can close the wound." His words cracked with desperation, but some began to listen. Fear softened even the hardest loyalty. A woman shouted, "She must go. If she stays, the river will take all of us." Another answered with equal fury, "And if we hand her over, the church will burn us anyway. Do you not see? We are damned either way." The crowd fractured into shoving, screaming chaos. Neighbors who once shared bread now pulling each other by the hair, fathers raising fists against old friends. Through it all, Elin stood calm at the river's edge, her hand pressed to the ice as though in communion. The moonlight made her seem both mortal and more than mortal, her shadow stretching long over the cracked surface. Falk clung to her shoulder, pleading, "Stop this. Let them believe you guilty. Let them take you. Better you alone than every soul here." Her eyes flickered toward him, soft for a fleeting instant. "Would you have me die for their lies? Would you have me kneel to men who burn truth to keep power warm?" Her voice hardened, cold as the wind. "No, if I die, it will not be as their offering. It will be as the river's bride." The soldiers, cornered between villagers' rage and the river's fury, raised shields, but their discipline wavered. One stumbled, whispering prayers to a god who seemed absent from the frozen chaos. Another threw down his weapon entirely, retreating into the night. The captain still clung to the fisher's edge, his breath coming in gasps, his sword lost beneath the black water. The river thundered, louder now, a rhythm that seemed to answer Elin's heartbeat. The villagers froze in awe and terror as a sheet of ice snapped upward, a jagged wall rising from the current as though summoned. Water sprayed across the square, baptizing them in the cold breath of judgment. And in that moment, every soul knew. The village would not leave this night untouched. Either Elin would fall, or the river would take them all. The night cracked open with a roar that drowned every prayer, every scream, every clatter of steel. The river split wide, vomiting black water into the square. It surged forward in a torrent, sweeping torches, fences, and men alike into its freezing grasp. The villagers shrieked as the flood swallowed the earth beneath their feet, pulling them down, tearing families apart with currents stronger than chains. The captain lost his grip on the ice and plunged into the abyss. His shout was short-lived, silenced as the river sealed over him. The priest, still on his knees, raised his arms to the sky, his voice breaking into madness. "Lord, smite her! Smite the whore of the deep!" But his words were cut short as the surge knocked him backward, his body tumbling across the snow. He clung desperately to the steps of the church, his fingers raw and bleeding, but even then his eyes burned with hatred for the woman who stood untouched at the river's edge. Elin did not falter. Cloaked in spray and moonlight, she seemed less like a woman and more like a monument carved from the storm itself. Around her, villagers clawed for survival. Some reached for her, begging for salvation, while others cursed her name even as water filled their mouths. She stood unmoving, her hand pressed flat against the trembling ice, whispering to it as though comforting a lover in pain. Falk, chest heaving, fought against the current that licked at his boots. He seized her arm again, shouting through the roar, "End it! End this before there's nothing left. You say the river is justice, but justice leaves no one alive." His voice cracked with desperation. "You are not its bride, Elin. You are its prissy owner." For the first time, her expression broke. A flicker of grief, fleeting as the breath on her lips. "Prisoner or bride," she murmured. "Does it matter? We are bound all the same." Behind them, a child slipped from her mother's grasp and tumbled toward the rushing water. The crowd screamed, but before the river could claim her, Elin turned. She raised her hand, and the ice closed, snapping shut like jaws, halting the flood for one fragile instant. The child slid against the frozen surface, wailing but alive. The crowd stared, stunned, as if seeing proof of a truth too vast for words. In that moment, the village split for the last time. Half dropped to their knees, bowing before Elin, their eyes wide with reverence. The others screamed her name with hatred, demanding her sacrifice. The choice hung in the air like a blade. Betray her to the church's will, or embrace her as the river's chosen. The ice groaned once more, waiting for their answer. The wind howled across the square as though it too awaited the decision. The villagers, drenched and trembling, clutched their children, their torches, their fear. The priest, blood running down his temple, staggered upright and screamed above the chaos. "She is no savior. She is the serpent itself. Cast her to the ice and let the river take her." His voice cracked, but the words cut deep. Several men surged forward, their rage sharpened by grief, their hands reaching to drag Elin down. But others, mothers who had seen their children spared, widows who had felt the water hold them gently instead of tearing them away, fell to their knees. They pressed their foreheads into the slush, chanting her name as though it were a hymn. "Elin, Elin, Elin." The sound grew, fragile at first, then thunderous, echoing over the rushing flood. Falk stood between the two halves of the mob, his sword drawn, his eyes burning with fury. "Enough!" he roared, but his command could not mend what had already shattered. The village was no longer one body, but two, one that demanded her sacrifice, and one that worshipped her as divine. Elin raised her hands, her voice soft but carrying above the storm. "There is no choice left. The river has already taken what it demands." Her gaze swept the crowd, her eyes dark wells of sorrow. It was never vengeance, it was never mercy, it was hunger, and hunger cannot be bargained with. The ice split beneath her feet, a crack stretching like a scar across the square. Steam hissed from the wound, and from it came a glow, pale, green, like the light beneath a frozen sea. The villagers gasped as a shadow moved beneath the surface, vast and coiling, something older than any church, any crown, any prayer. The priest fell silent, his mouth open, eyes wide with horror. His faith shattered in a single breath. Falk's grip on his sword loosened. He whispered, barely audible, "God help us." Elin turned to him, her expression unreadable. "No, Falk. The river does not forgive. It only remembers." With those words, she stepped forward and placed both palms upon the ice. The crack widened, swallowing her form in a spray of water and light. Her voice, calm and resigned, echoed one final time. "I was never yours. I was always his." The flood surged high, then stilled. The roar faded into silence. When the spray cleared, the river had retreated, leaving behind a shattered square and a broken village. Elin was gone. Some swore she had drowned, claimed by the depths. Others whispered that she had descended willingly, not as victim, but as queen. And in the years that followed, when the river froze and the ice groaned in the dead of night, the villagers would hear a woman's voice carried on the wind, soft, mournful, eternal. They would remember her not as sinner or saint, but as the bride of the river. And no one in the valley ever dared speak her name aloud again,